So now on to the next panel, which is on the rule of law. And I'll give the word to Florian Bieber, who will be the moderator of this panel. So take it away, Florian.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to continue after Nicola Dimitrov's intervention. And I think, as he has said, the discussion of rule of law is really one which involves both member states and the future member states of the European Union, rather than separating those two. We have a panel of 3 speakers, and I will introduce them briefly before giving them the floor, and we'll have a brief statements or kind of reflections on the topic of the rule of law in the Western Balkans and how that links to rule of law debates in the European Union. And we're, of course, are talking about this at a moment when, in fact, the EU for the first time is seeking to link rule of law conditionality within the European Union to funding. And we've seen some critical voices from Hungary and Poland, and to some degree also Slovenia on that, which shows you really how this is controversial and difficult within the European Union as well. So without further ado, we have 3 speakers. Jovana Marović, who is the executive director of the Politikon network in Montenegro. She's been involved in a number of different think tanks in the country, as well as working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs a few years ago, and following the question of the rule of law in the negotiation process in Montenegro closely. The second speaker is going to be Marko Kmezić, who is a lecturer and senior researcher at the University of Graz, who has published extensively on EU rule of law conditionality in the Western Balkans, and published a book on that with Routledge a few years ago, and co-authored with me a study recently published on rule of law in the EU and the Western Balkans. And then our third speaker is Tena Prelec, who is at the University of Oxford, a research fellow, and has been focusing on anti-corruption initiatives, money laundering, as well as the role of external actors. And she's also a research associate at LISI, the Center for Southeast European Research at the London School of Economics. And she is, together with the other 2 speakers, a member of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group. So I would ask all 3 of them to have their, we can see all of them. So I would give the floor, first of all, to Jovana, with kicking us up with some thoughts on how the rule of law and how this link with the European integration process can be best reflected.
Thank you very much, Florian. I'm also happy to be today at this panel, but it's really not promising moment for the EU enlargement and for the perspective of the EU enlargement for the Western Balkan countries. We are all quite aware that the rule of law, establishing of the rule of law in the Western Balkans is one of the main obstacles for the democratization of the countries of the Western Balkans. And in that sense, there are 2, let's say, main problems in that direction. The first one is that the rule of law reform is really complex. It's not about the just adoption of the laws and strengthening the capacity within these institutions. And that was so far focus of the governments in the Western Balkans. And on the other side, the EU conditionality framework is not enough. It's not covering all the aspects of the rule of law reform in the Western Balkan countries, and this is not satisfactory a framework for the rule of law agenda and the reform in the Western Balkans. The EU policy towards the Western Balkans has had so far in the recent years many ups and downs. First of all, the EU was focused on developing new framework, and that was the first strategy for the credible enlargement 2 years ago. And during this year, the EU actually also presented the new methodology in February with new instruments, with the new framework, with the new clusters. And it was a promise for the Albania and North Macedonia for the opening of negotiations for these 2 countries, but also Serbia and Montenegro as the countries which are negotiating already membership for the EU. They also accepted this new methodology. But in practice, there are not much developments in that direction. So what is still positive in this new framework is the economic support and support from the EU for the economic consolidation of the Western Balkan countries, but when it comes to democracy, there are obvious backsliding in regard to many parameters, actually to all parameters when it comes to the rule of law. What are the challenges in that direction? There is widespread corruption in the Western Balkans. There is governance through clientelism. There is lack of accountability, integrity, transparency. And at the end, when it comes to the EU, there is primacy of political over merit-based decision-making. And also we are still missing this promised new framework and new instruments, sanctions and incentives for the Western Balkans in accordance with the results in the rule of law reform or lack of such results. As a result of all of these challenges and obstacles in the rule of law reform in the Western Balkans, there is erosion of the public trust, first of all in the institutions in the Western Balkans, but also in the EU accession process as such. So what should be done, and is it realistic to expect more commitment from the EU side in that sense? I think that the Western Balkan countries do not fit in the same policy framework, and that there is a need for specific approach for each of the countries of the Western Balkans. That means that it will be helpful to have roadmaps with timelines for the Western Balkan countries in terms of specific priorities on annual basis, to have like clear timeline for moving from one stage to another, not like huge stages from the opening negotiations to joining the EU, but like small steps on annual basis to link it with sanctions and incentives to be clear whether the country is delivering or not. Then the second thing is that the new methodology in practice and new instruments should be further developed. We are still not sure what is happening with the new methodology and how this whole story about 6 clusters will look like in practice, and how it will be implemented in North Macedonia and Albania, and how Montenegro will actually fit in this new framework. When the Commissioner for Neighborhood and Enlargement presented the annual reports during the last month, he said that the new reports are thorough, but they are fair in assessment, and that the recommendations are now clear and strict. I would say, and our joint effort from the BiEPAG actually showed that the new reports are better in assessment of the situation on the ground, but that recommendations are still not clear enough and that they should be more specific. The second thing about the new methodology is that now the member states are more involved in providing inputs for the progress report, the annual reports, but actually what we need in practice is more understanding what is happening on the ground and more communication between the member states and the authorities in the countries. Then the EU should combine all existing the rule of law instruments. That means that there should be clear link between non-papers, between the benchmarks, between the annual reports. We have recently conducted 4 focus groups on specific instruments in in 4 Western Balkan countries. Bieber reports, non-papers, vetting process, and the rule of law council in Montenegro, and there was a conclusion that the annual reports should be built on the lessons learned from the Bieber report in Bosnia and Macedonia, that there should be specific in-depth analysis for most problematic area when it comes to the rule of law reform, and that in that sense that non-papers should also be published for the all Western Balkan countries in terms of covering some specific thematic areas and not just be repetition of the country reports. Then I think that Marko will cover this topic more about the deficit of democracy also in the EU member states. The EU is also providing the scoreboards and reports for the EU member states, but I see it as like a joint effort, like that efforts on democratization and building the rule of law in the Western Balkans and in the EU member states should go hand in hand, and this will be not like additional effort for the EU and for the European Commission. And then the third thing is that the EU should provide credible and real perspective of the EU membership for the Western Balkan countries. Our political elites are not interested in the reforms if there is no EU membership at the horizon. Let's use the example of Montenegro, which is negotiating for 8 years. We have the same issues and the same problems when it comes to the rule of law as 8 years ago when we started the whole negotiation process. So this is something which should be connected with the instruments and with these roadmaps, something which should be, let's say, credible and tangible for the Western Balkans, with real benefits for its citizens. And then for the end, the EU should include more civil society and media in assessment of the situation of the ground. The European Commission is consulting the civil society prior to presentation of the annual report, but I think that there should be more concrete, let's say, inputs from the civil society in developments of these new instruments and action plans and roadmaps for the Western Balkans, and that the civil society should in some way not to repeat all over again assessments and findings from the country reports, so that they should provide white papers or shadow reports on reflecting what should be done more in terms of inputs and in terms of reforms on the ground. And finally, when it comes to transparency, I think that the European integration process really influenced the transparency on the ground in the Western Balkans, but there are still many data which is still not published, and which is still not something which is available and to citizens of the Western Balkans. More complicated the issue on the agenda, the institutions are more closed. I think there is a need for additional pressure from the EU on authorities to be open and to open reforms to the public. This is all, of course, if the EU has will still to be more, to provide more efforts and to be more engaged in the Western Balkan countries. So this is for now. I'm here for the questions.
Thank you so much, Jovana. I think the key message here is that the enlargement is not seen as shortcutting rule of law. And in fact, those of us who've been advocating the enlargement and the inclusion of the Western Balkans in the European Union, in fact, are doing so from the perspective of that we need actually better and more effective tools of dealing with the rule of law questions, rather than that countries should get in the EU ignoring the rule of law. So it's in a certain way not a certain way. This does remain, and with further fine-tuning and improvement is important in actually achieving the rule of law in the region. And so in that sense, we have to think about constructive ways of achieving that. But let's turn to Marko, who will talk a little bit also about the linkages between rule of law challenges within the European Union and the Western Balkans. Marko, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, indeed, I think that this beautifully feeds into what we've heard in the opening statement by Deputy Prime Minister and what Jovana has mentioned. And the point is that not only EU aspirants, but also several EU member states are confronted with grave threats to the functioning system of rule of law. And in some cases, for example, in Italy or Greece, these challenges have never disappeared, while in other instances, in Hungary and Poland, they have re-emerged after the countries have joined the EU. And therefore, this feeds into the question posted by the hosts and their fear about accepting newcomers with similar set of problems. So for me as a lawyer, when I start looking into these particular examples, but also when I look into the countries of the Western Balkans that are currently candidates for EU membership, and I start examining their laws and constitutions, I do not find major shortcomings on the legal side of the puzzle. Apparently the absence of the rule of law across Europe can mainly be observed elsewhere. It is rather through the creation of these regime-centered legal settings, allowing for total arbitrariness and violence of the ruling elites over and neglecting legal setting. And this has led to a wide-ranging erosion of, first of all, independent institutions and control of the judiciary and independent media, which is a common feature that which is shared between the Western Balkans and then again critical number of EU member states. And therefore, I see the rule of law as a seminal problem that requires a response both within the EU and at the same time towards future member states. And in an answer to the rising rule of law problems across the Union, the Commission has announced a new toolbox of measures that is debated as we speak. And at the same time, the respect for the rule of law has been spelled out as one of the EU's fundamental conditions for Western Balkans EU enlargement. And by closely looking into both documents and both strategies, I found that they both suffer from major shortcomings that put into question their overall effectiveness. And I will be summarizing these shortcomings under 3 pillars of Union's rule of law enforcement, namely, first of all, the EU's ability to effectively answer in situations where a problem of sufficient significance is detected. Secondly, the EU's capacity to monitor and intervene at an early stage of rule of law deterioration. And finally, the lack of effective mechanisms for spreading of rule of law in Europe. And by comparing these 2 strategic documents, I believe that I found ways to significantly prove them by simply borrowing from each other. These 2 documents could be seen complementarily and fill in some of the gaps. I've identified 4 of them, and with this, I would leave it later for Q&A, but I would like to identify some of these. First, member states are vetted for their compliance with the rule of law before they accede the Union, obviously. However, to this date, effective mechanisms to supervise and regularly monitor adherence to the rule of law after accession remain only in infancy. The procedure to invoke a clear risk of serious breach under Article 7 Treaty of European Union remains unattainable as we speak due to high decision-making thresholds. Alternatively, the suspension of membership negotiations and any financial assistance from the EU to the candidate countries in case of breaching the rule of law is a procedure that suffers from a different set of problems, as only one member state can raise the overall balance clause to prevent further opening of negotiating chapters until progress has been achieved. And obviously such a setup risks repeating the apparent mistake of 2019 French veto on opening of North Macedonia and Albanian EU accession talks. So clear recommendation here would be that in an event of treaty change, reviewing Article 7 to lower the thresholds for decision would be preferable and should take the form of reversed qualified majority, while gatekeeping its steps leading up to the EU membership requires a higher threshold, at least 2 member states to be more precise. Secondly, the new EU approach to chapters 23 and 24 rely on a set of interim benchmark system that would assess the country's preparedness to open and close negotiating chapters and introduces safeguards. However, in practice, these interim benchmarks are very broad and represent a long-term goal, which makes their assessments rather superficial. And quite similarly, the case law of the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights that provide for the key EU rule of law requirements to be respected by the EU and its member states are not always sufficiently known. And to fill up these gaps, it would be useful that the EU develops fundamental set of EU rule of law benchmarks that would be applied on candidate and member states alike, of course, notwithstanding the need for acknowledging their specific context and legal traditions. Next, the likelihood of the effectiveness of EU rule of law efforts decreases with number of domestic veto players that are incurring significant, let's call it damage from reform processes. And recent convictions in Croatia of the former Prime Minister Ivo Sanader, or former North Macedonian Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski on embezzlement charges are a good reminder of the harmful effect which EU reforms can have for established elites. And given the nature of the negotiation process, which depoliticizes the democratization processes by focusing their efforts on elites, reminds us of what Jovana has mentioned and what we will hear in the next panel, I believe, is the need for a more inclusive bottom-up approach to EU rule of law promotion, in which civil society actors, constructive grassroots and local initiatives are empowered by the EU to play a decisive role vis-a-vis public authority. And this would help to push for compliance of key laws and monitor their implementation and influence norm internalization before, during, and also after EU membership negotiations. So I would conclude with this and keep it open for the Q&A later.
Thank you. And I think one of the key points which Marko has made is again, the linkage of looking both what is happening in the European Union in terms of trying to deal with the rule of law, and in the Western Balkans, and in a certain way, mutually learning lessons from both for each other. And I think one key point takeaway is that, of course, you cannot address all future rule of law issues in the accession process. The hope to have an accession process which is so strict and so rigid that it prevents any backsliding afterwards is illusionary. So what one needs is actually a mechanism which ensures that rule of law is a guiding principle of the behavior of governments once they're in the European Union, and front-loading it prior to accession is not going to really deliver what is necessary and what the concerns are of many citizens and many governments in the European Union at the moment. So now we turn to our third presenter, Tena Prelec, who will talk a little bit about also the issue of what these are the implications for democracy at large, and of course also what it means in terms of investments, and also she's also looked at the role of other external actors, and of course that is very much linked to the question of rule of law in the Western Balkans. So Tena, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Florian, and thank you very much to the organizers. So given this kind invitation by our Danish host, I thought I will pay homage in my introductory remarks to one of my favorite TV series of all time, which is Borgen. I mean, I can't pretend to know much about Danish politics, but I do know the TV series quite well indeed. And one of the reasons why I love it so much is that in spite of its twists and turns, in spite of its electricity and all the controversies that accompany it, in some way, watching it was extremely relaxing to me. And I tried to reflect on why it was so relaxing. And I came to the conclusion that in spite of politics being a dirty and difficult business everywhere, and in all countries without exceptions, you must come to some compromises, and it's never black and white. In Borgen, there are some pillars of certitude that accompany the political activity and the political arena, which are absent in the Balkans. So I'll try to explain why is that, with what implications for the rule of law, and what we can do about it. And although the picture that I'm going to paint initially will seem very bleak from the outside, I will also argue that as soon as you look beneath the surface, it is not actually so bleak. And I will argue that the moment to act is now, and that it is important to have Danish politicians and the Danish people on board in this sense. So the first pillar of certitude, of course, front and center in the series, is the activity of women in politics. So Brigitte Nuber, the protagonist, is really a true leader who does not need to bow to any man. There is no need at all for her to demonstrate that she's not the token woman there. She's there on her own merits. In the Balkans, I'm afraid to say this is not so simple. A very lampant example of this is the recently formed government in Serbia after many months that the elections were concluded. And this government was hailed in the headlines of most international media as one of the most gender equal governments in Europe and in. And that, if you look just a little bit beneath the surface, you will see that what was rewarded in the composition of that government was not professionalism and was not even gender, but it was loyalty to the regime in the person of the most important politician in Serbian in Serbia today, which is the president Aleksandar Vučić. So a very clear exemplification of that is that the portfolio given to these new women that entered the government does not actually match the competencies that they have. So for instance, Darija Kisić-Tepavčević from the COVID task force, she became a minister, but she's a doctor, and so she was part of the Serbia's efforts to tackle the coronavirus crisis. And yet she was not given the health ministry, as it would be fitting to her profession, but she was given she was made in charge of the social affairs portfolio. Whereas on the other hand, the health ministry stayed with Mr. Zlatibor Lončar, who's also been called Dr. Death in some media reports, because investigations have actually shown his very close contacts with the mafia, and even found him perhaps implicated in a killing. On the other hand, we also see that the finance minister is still held by Mr. Siniša Mali, who is very loyal to the Serbian political class, and who's been implicated in endless corruption affairs. And at the same time, we also have a Ministry of Family and Demography, which is now held by a renowned right-winger who has also expressed the very much LGBT, anti-LGBT positions. So what's the point of all this? The point is that it is important not to fall for these smoke screens. So although what emerged from the composition of this government was that it was very gender equal, and this was a story that was sold, if you will, abroad, the important story is that A, loyalty was rewarded and not professionalism, and B, that actually very, very controversial elements of the government that were considered salvageable from the previous mandate are still part and parcel of the Serbian leadership today, with consequences, of course, for the rule of law, as I pointed out, for instance, in the cases of Mr. Siniša Mali and others. A second pillar of certitude is that I found in Borgen quite reassuring, is that ideology is strongly held, and again, it's not a mere smoke screen. So in some ways, even the parties, like for instance, the right-wing party that has some is painted in some ways with some ugliness, they do hold some degree of genuinity in the convictions that are part of the party. At least that's how I perceived it. On the other hand, in the Balkans, this is also something that you cannot take completely for granted, and the reason is more or less a similar one to what I outlined so far. And it is that Balkan leaders with autocratic tendencies have learned very well how to make use of ideology to cast themselves and their opponents in the right light for them to have a dominance on the political in the political arena. So they know that these messages of ethnic and religious divisions are ones that resonate most strongly in the outside world, because they're the ones through which the Balkans have been known for many decades now, unfortunately. And they have learned to use it to their advantage. One example can be found in Montenegro, where the ruling party of over 30 years, the party of now President Milo Đukanović, has monopolized the discourse about the Montenegrin identity, and also has attempted and still is attempting to monopolize the Euro-Atlantic integration discourse as only possible to be carried out through their own party, and has tried to paint anybody who is in opposition to them as a nationalist or a pro-Russian actor. Now, at the latest elections in late August, there has been a very remarkable change in the political leadership in the country. President Milo Đukanović has not managed to form the majority in government. The results were interpreted in a very controversial way, because on the one hand you have this narrative in which has painted the opposition monolithically as a nationalist pro-Russian actor. And on the other hand, there have been voices that have tried to explain why the situation is more complicated. So although there are several position, worldviews that have come together, on the other hand, it is undeniable that the messages of anti-corruption and of standing up for the rule of law, and also of a pro-European perspective, were front and center in the dialogue, in the discourse heading up to the elections. So this is really, really important. A third pillar of certitude is, of course, the trust in the whole process, in the whole democratic process and in the elections. So even in the ugliest twists and turns, I find that the characters in Balkan, they do keep their trust that ultimately politics is something that they can confide in. In the Balkans, again, it is not so simple, for also partially, the reasons that I've highlighted now and my colleagues before me. Trust in institutions in the countries of the Western Balkans is by and large very low. And it is also quite low, the trust in the capacity of the opposition to make a real change, given the limited results so far over the past 30 decades of the transition process, as we call it. And yet, it's really interesting from our recent results from the Ipsos survey that the European Fund for the Balkans and BiEPAG have carried out, that in Montenegro, the example that I used right now, in which a change has occurred through elections very recently, this trust has increased sharply. So you have a situation in which in Albania, the trust of citizens for change through elections is at 38%. This figure is at 43% in Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. In Montenegro, this figure stands now at 80%. It's double. So this tells us that when things change, and they can change, the attitudes of people also change. And another interesting figure also from the same survey says that trust in election boycotts is extremely low by and large. So for instance, in Serbia, it's at 26%, where the election boycotts have not brought to great results so far. And yet in Macedonia, it's double this figure almost. It's almost 50%. Because in North Macedonia, we had a situation in which a prolonged boycott of the parliament, and in some ways a procrastinating of the elections in order to bring for more fair and free conditions for elections, has brought ultimately for a change in government, and has brought to this new government that also Nikola Dimitrov is part of. What is the key crucial discriminant between the two? In North Macedonia, there was, of course, a grassroots effort, but there was also a help from both the US, there was an effort from the US, and also from the EU, crucially through this Prelec report that analyzed in depth the situation of state capture and what are the targeted issues to do. And therefore, you can see that that again, there is a discriminant, a difference in the perceptions, and you can see how important it is for this the effort from the EU and also from the US when they act together, how it can actually make a difference. So I was telling you all that because a lot of our effort as researchers and analysts is directed at explaining these intricacies of these messages and how they are used, and they should be properly understood. And it does not happen that there are a lot of course spin doctors both in the West and in the East trying to muddy the waters to present these issues in a different way. But as you can see, not all is lost. And another remark, and I'm coming to the end. So far, I have only presented the Danish situation in a very good light. But I would also like to remark the fact that one of the biggest money laundering scandals in recent years was that of Danske Bank. So very much a Danish issue. And this is not surprising because today corruption, the rule of law, they are extremely interconnected. They indeed are global. And when you think that 200 billion of euros of suspicious Eastern Europeans money went through. And I think in Denmark, you also need to be aware of the fact that there is your role in the whole process and you need to take ownership for it. So my recommendations for you today are simple. There are three. One is do not fall for these smoke screens that I've outlined. The autocrats have learned how to make use of them and they attract the attention from all the rest. Do not fall for that, and do not authorize your colleagues to, for instance, as we saw after the elections, in which several EU leaders have congratulated uncritically the elections in Serbia, although they were marred by a lot of problems. Second is to be courageous in defending the rule of law. So to pushing, for instance, European Parliament groupings to stand up for it. It does make a big difference. And third is really to engage with the grassroots. We said it many times, but it really is worth it. Western Balkan peoples are starting to take ownership and to rise against corruption and inequality. We had a question beforehand, why are the Western Balkans not making themselves democratic? As you can see, they are. There are pockets of people who are doing that. And once upon a time, we had a situation in which corruption was not mobilizing people. Now it is. But these constituencies are fragile and they do need your support. And yet this is the moment when they are rising up. So do not waste this momentum. Thank you very much. Back to you, Florian.
Thank you so much, Tena. And I think what is important also from your messages is, of course, that the rule of law is a question of democracy at the end of the day. It's not about just technicalities, but it's about whether or not countries are governed in a democratic way. And as we'll have in the next panel a chance to hear, there's a lot of grassroots demand and initiatives in the region to try to push for it. And in a certain way, it's about finding allies in the European Union in this quest and in making sure that the countries are governed by the rule of law. And that this challenge, of course, is one which is similar in many EU member states. So now we have a chance, we have roughly 20 minutes for a conversation, and I would like to use the opportunity of some of the questions raised in the Q&A, and you're of course welcome to add your questions there, and I will take them and put them to the panelists in a kind of conversational way. And if you don't mind, I will also reformulate them or fit them. And please, ask questions related primarily to the question to rule of law. And I mean, this is, I think, one of the first questions which comes up is about the case of Albania and the Prime Minister kind of arguing that the whole reason why Albania is facing more conditions than North Macedonia is based on domestic issues. And I think I want to ask this question to all of you, not in this direct way, but more about how do you deal with this kind of the challenge that the EU accession process is sometimes determined by internal considerations in the member states, like we have now in the case of Bulgaria, or like France was skeptical towards enlargement last year towards Albania and North Macedonia. But at the same time, there are these conditions, right? And there are important conditions regarding to the rule of law. Isn't it muddying the waters? And how can we deal with this challenge that local leaders then say, well, we're not moving forward, not because of us, but it's because of the member states, right? And in the case of what Deputy Prime Minister Dimitrov has said, this is, of course, in the case of Bulgaria, it's very obviously the case. But then in other instances, it's less clear cut. And then the question is the EU conditionality actually still working? So I don't know, Jovana, do you want to take a stab at this question?
Yes, I think that the conditions are really important in terms of, they are just tackling the issues and they are highlighting what is going wrong in the countries. In that sense, it's good to have it. It's good to just, the efforts towards the democratization should be somehow directed from somewhere, and it's good that the EU is putting this in the conditions for the Western Balkan countries. But as you said, it's not good if the country is delivering and there is no formal recognition from the EU level. It's not good that the political decision making is have primacy over the merit-based decision making and approach, which is crucial for the European integration of the countries, not just of the Western Balkan countries, and that's something which is highlighted in the new EU methodology. So in that sense, it will be good to see some kind of incentives for the Western Balkans if they are fulfilling their obligations, if the conditions are met. And as I said already, it's also important to have more concrete conditions on annual basis in order to really be able to measure whether the progress is achieved. So in that sense, it's really frustrating to see that, for example, North Macedonia is country which is fulfilling the criteria, but there is no progress in the negotiations.
I think this is an important point, because what you're saying is, of course, that if you have conditionality and rule of law, then you have to make sure to reward those who fulfill the conditions. Because if you don't, then of course you undermine the demands in the first place. Because first of all, why would anybody fulfill the conditions if there's no guarantee that once they do, they can advance? And on the other side, it muddies the waters. I mean, I think, to pick up on Tena's term, that it becomes unclear that why do countries advance? Is it because of, or why do countries not advance? So those who are not serious about the rule of law can always blame EU member states and can say, well, it's not because of our lack of effort, but it's because country X or country Y doesn't like to see enlargement, or doesn't like us, or doesn't like our language. And as a result, it becomes very hard for the EU to communicate the clarity of conditions, right? This is, I think, one of the big problems. Marko, do you want to add to this question something?
Yeah, well, I mean, briefly, I think that the real danger is twofold. First of all, the EU should not use the rule of law and democracy as two sides of the, or in fact, it should be using it as two sides of the same coin. It should apply equal demands internally and externally. And this actually takes out the card from the hands of those elites that blame the EU of acting unilaterally simply towards the region. But at the same time, how actually to debunk this myth of blaming the EU for their own shortfalls in delivering rule of law and democracy? Well, quite simple. And as mentioned already several times in this panel, there are critical voices that needs to be strengthened, that needs to be supported by the EU. And hereby, I mean independent media and grassroots organizations who are able to confront such claims from within the region. And they need to be enabled and supported in calling a spade, and actually delivering key message of the lack of commitment of the domestic elites in meeting EU criteria, instead of taking an easy way out and simply blaming the EU.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I would maybe just pick up on some of the other questions, and Tena, you can also then respond to that. I mean, I think one of the questions says, Hans-Georg Nielsen says, there are emerging voices in Albania and other countries of the region that the EU is acting like a cynical colonial power. And I think this is maybe a larger question of kind of rising EU skepticism as a result of this process being maybe not. And I think we have the challenge on two sides, right? On one side, it's that it's seen as being arbitrary or not being merit-based. And on the other side, maybe how the EU is interacting with more authoritarian tendencies in the region. I mean, I think this is the other challenge, which I think we need to confront, where the EU might be seen as supporting those who are actually breaking the rule of law a bit too uncritically. Is this something, Tena, you wanna pick up on as a question, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are really, really good remarks. So the idea behind the new EU enlargement methodology is one that I've supported, and also other colleagues from BiEPAG. I've worked with Milica Delevic, for instance, in setting out some guidelines that could inform it. And I think that the idea, behind having a more closely associated, meaningful progress with rewards is an important one. And also that backsliding, as Nikola Dimitrov said earlier, that is also taken into account. These are important points, because so far there hasn't been this sense that progress is rewarded meaningfully and rightly so. And therefore, going towards that direction is important. And the idea was that this would take some of the power from member states blocking the progress of EU accession countries on bilateral issues, and that it would expose them and shame them into not doing so because the progress is so more clearly aligned. Clearly, we're seeing that there are still some countries that are bypassing it, and clearly we're seeing that there is the need for more forceful action from I would say other also EU member states to stand up and to say that blocking on these bilateral issues basis is just not acceptable. And I think that that the argument for implementing a qualified majority vote at key moments of the EU enlargement process is getting stronger and stronger, because what we're seeing now doesn't have anything do anymore with real merit. It is really something that is associated with very contingent considerations from the Bulgarian leadership in this case that are very much navel gazing and don't have anything to do with real progress. So I think this is something that for the EU's sake they need to tackle, because it really gives a very bad image of it. Another issue that we discussed about many times is the failure to give visa liberalization to Kosovo after all the requirements have been fulfilled. So that is another issue in which it would be a really welcome step for the EU to act on that. So I'm mentioning these elements because then, yes, because when you have these incongruencies, then absolutely the member of the audience is correct. You have you give more credence to the argument that the EU is a colonial power and that is only taking away good and educated workforce away from the Western Balkans, that it is only treating this super periphery of the European Union as its own backyard without helping profoundly. So, and these arguments may be partially actually genuinely held, and on the other hand, they might also be amplified for political purposes, as we've seen earlier. So this is why it's very important that action is taken in this respect.
Thanks for that. I mean, I think there's another question which I'd like to pose, and that there are two questions currently, and the last one I'll save kind of for the conclusion. But the next one is by Dukajin Abduli, who is asking, and I mean, he's asking for Serbia, how long will the EU tolerate the deterioration of the rule of law and democracy and the Western Balkans in general, and Serbia in particular. I think this is a question of how do you deal with backsliding? How do you deal with, how should the European Union respond with regression in the rule of law and in the question of in the issue of democracy? And of course, this is, I think, one of the big concerns which countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, and others have been articulating over the years. They worry that the beginning of accession process triggers some kind of nearly automatic and unstoppable process, and the countries of the Western Balkans will join the European Union no matter how badly they're doing. And of course, this perception is less based on the current experience. I think we've heard from all of you how long this process takes and how open its outcome is. But of course, based on the experience of Bulgaria and Romania, which joined, in a certain way, despite the best judgment of many of those who were at the time part of the process. So how to not just stop the process, but also how to deal with it. What is the best way and what is currently available? Jovana, do you want to tell us a little bit how you see this?
Yes, I think that how the EU is assessing the rule of law situation in Serbia, for example, they are not progressing in the negotiation process. They are not opening the chapters, negotiating chapters, and that's how the EU sees the strategy, like punishing Serbia for the lack of the results in the rule of law. But in that sense, they are not helping to prevent backsliding, and that's not the key for. We are always trying to say to the European Union, to the European Commission, that they should highlight such practices, illiberal practices in the annual reports, in their statements and everything. But that's also not the way. As I said many times during this presentation, the way is that they should have conditionality on like economic support, on funds and everything, and that the results in the rule of law reform should be connected with such support. That's the way. And that's also the same situation in Montenegro. Montenegro is opening negotiating chapters. So Montenegro so far it has opened all negotiating chapters to 33 and closed just 3 of them. But that's also not the sign that we are that we have bettered the rule of law in the country. That's not the thing, and that's not the case in Montenegro. So I guess we are all hoping in this new methodology that will fix the situation on the ground, and that we will see a better framework in terms of and that this new model, which has been approved in EU, like funds and sanctions and the results in the rule of law, will be also implemented for the Western Balkans. In one hand, it's not good for our economic consolidation, but that's something which will somehow force political elite to do something about the rule of law.
Thank you, Jovana. Marko, your take.
Well, I mean, I can only concur and highlight what has been said. Of course, the key message is also strengthening these domestic elites. And I believe that the next panel will be more adequate to perhaps answer those challenges and to address those challenges and basically create this sandwich structure whereby the pressure on the elites will be held from the above. Ideally, that will be the EU and the international institutions, but also from below. And this will be this will enable this double pressure on the elites to deliver on their promises and to avoid simply rhetoric, dedication to the enlargement process, and to enable them to do their job better to the satisfaction of both the citizens and to bring the region closer to the goal of becoming a part of the EU.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So I think a couple of points emerge clearly. I mean, one of them is, of course, there's a shift I think we can see in terms of trying to find new tools to deal with the rule of law, both in the European Union this year, as well as towards the Western Balkans. Jovana has mentioned the new methodology, which was designed as a response to the French blocking of accession talks. The question is really whether that methodology is still in a certain way in the development phase. So we don't know the reality of it, both in terms of how it will be worked, but also how consistently it will be applied. And I think maybe one of the key points is that rather than in a certain way be skeptical in general or have individual member states block the process, it's pushing the Commission to really use its toolkit and develop its toolkits to the fullest extent. Because we have also in the past had tools like the Bieber reports, which have developed, as well as the imbalance clause, which actually allows for a kind of intervention in the negotiation process, but they haven't been used or haven't been used as much as they could be. So to some degree, it's can have the greatest toolkit in the world, but you've got to use the tools. And sometimes that's more important than having all of them look nice on paper, but the reality of using them is really crucial. I'll give a last round to all of you with a kind of a parting question by Christopher Nielsen, who asked a question which I think is a good transition for our next panel, which is asking about how the EU can support better civil society to ensure that they are helping in this sandwich dynamic, which Marko has talked about. Namely, the sandwich dynamic, of course, is that you have the EU pressing from the top down in terms of rule of law requirements, and you have citizens pressing bottom up. And I think they're both there. All surveys indicate that citizens do want to live in countries governed by the rule of law, just like all EU citizens are in favor of linking funding of the EU to rule of law. So there's a certain way citizens do have the same demand in the Western Balkans as they have in the European Union as well, but how to make the sandwich effective so that those in power respond to both. And so the question is, how can the EU really help and keep up the pressure from below, support the pressure from below to make it effective? And I think with that question and answering that question, we'll have a good transition to the subsequent panel. Tena, do you want to go ahead for our last round and last observation if you want to add anything else, about any other comments?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So how can the EU support civil society and demand for the rule of law? There are many ways indeed. There are a few very low-hanging fruits in this respect. I mean, today, and especially in COVID times, we're also globally interconnected, and there is really no reason at all why the citizens of the Western Balkans should not be included in discussions that are happening at an EU level. One such big discussion should be, because it still hasn't started in earnest, the Conference on the Future of Europe. So this really is a win-win for both the EU and the Balkans to build bridges and to discuss how to bring forward some issues that should and are close. Demand for the rule of law is actually in line both in the countries of the EU and the Western Balkans. The Green New Deal is another big issue. Digitalization, the fight against radicalization, etc. These are all issues in which the Western Balkans are absolutely part of, or should be part of the discussion. In terms of rule of law mechanisms, I could mention one. We just mentioned the investments at the beginning. We weren't able to touch upon that. But in 2019, the European Union has set up a screening mechanism for investments that was set up with China in mind. And yet the issue there, I would say, is that it focuses a lot on the security part of the whole process, whereas some aspects of it, such as governance and also specifically the effect on the environment, are very much treated as an afterthought. And yet in the Balkans, as we will for sure hear in the second panel, this is a massive issue. So the effect that these non-transparent deals are having on the lives of the citizens, on the day-to-day really experience, is massive. And this health hazard that is brought by the environmental damage that some of these backdoor deals bring is huge. And I'm bringing it up because it connects also with the issue of civil society, because civil society has mobilized a lot and has made this connection between the environment and the rule of law, I would say maybe before, the politicians in Brussels have made it. So this is a clear, avenue in which more attention, political attention must be given, and also more money, definitely more funding to make these efforts that are for now completely grassroots, sustainable and important in the long run. It is in the EU's interest as well as in the Western Balkan states' interest.
Great, thank you so much, Tena. Jovana, your final thoughts?
Thank you. I think that the EU is now testing the new model of funding the civil society, for example, in Montenegro, like model of re-granting, and the EU is also consulting the civil society what are the priorities for funding in Montenegro. And in that sense, I think what is missing that there should be an approach of linking activities of think tanks, for example, and grassroots in the Western Balkans. There is also need for a regional approach in terms of the rule of law reform and in terms of networking of the civil society. And as I already mentioned, I think the civil society should be more consulted in terms of new methodology and new instruments and new tools for the Western Balkans. This is something which is really, because the civil society is monitoring the situation in the countries and on the ground, and they are pretty much aware what is working and what is not working within the negotiations and within the European integration process and within the countries when it comes to the rule of law. So I think that there is a need for better connection between the civil society and more channels for communication between civil society, member states, and the European Commission, and for more involvement of civil society in this consultation process on the new methodology.
Great, thanks, Jovana. Marko, last final remarks.
Well, we've heard different ways. I'd say the most important is financial support for the civil society. But first of all, what just my interpretation of the civil society to begin with. I see it as a varied group of organizations and individuals, including not only NGOs and grassroots, but also independent state institutions, independent media, academia, etc., etc. So to begin with, I see that a sort of their independence should be nurtured against the ruling elites in the Balkans. So to enable them and to provide their opportunities to continue to be a critical voice and constructive voice from the region. And often I see that the EU has failed to maintain their independence. Of course, it has been crucial at establishing some of these organizations, for example, ombudspersons throughout the region. But then, after ticking this box of establishing such an office, it was rather silent on observing how many of these institutions have been simply dismantled under different pretexts and in different contexts in the region. So I see that apart from structural, financial, and other sort of support, the EU should be more vocal at attempts to reverse the work and establishment of such organizations. So to guarantee their independence throughout the process of enlargement would be something that the EU should particularly pay attention in the future.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. Thanks to Jovana, Marko, and Tena for your thoughts and insights. I think what we clearly see from our panel is that dealing with the rule of law in the accession process is work in progress. It's been, although on the top and front of the EU enlargement agenda for well over a decade, it's been clearly understood to not have delivered. And we've seen backsliding in the region in many countries. And we've also seen that EU member states are skeptical about whether or not the mechanisms and the attention is working. So this year has actually been a year where we've seen both changes in terms of rule of law coming towards policies for the Western Balkans, the new methodology, as well as in the EU itself in regard to funding. So this is, I think we all would say that this is a welcome change, but it has to be really functional, effective, and not become a smokescreen behind which countries stop and block the accession process for other reasons with which they undermine, of course, the EU and the enlargement process at large. With this, I can conclude this panel. The next panel will pick up on some of the topics of how and what kind of demand for democracy and rule of law we actually have in the region itself, and how in a certain way this links to the larger question of EU enlargement. So we have a break of 10 minutes now. So everybody who would like to stretch their legs, grab a cup of coffee or whatever else are welcome to do so. And we will continue at 12 o'clock. And so thanks to the panelists and thanks for the audience for being here.